So.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The doors are closing. It's time for our program to begin. And it is my great privilege this evening to introduce our speaker, Lori Erickson, who is the greatest travel writer in the world today. Without any doubt. She is the author of 3 books. You see the titles up here on the screen, one of which is available for you to acquire for your very own. If you go back to the table where that handsome gentleman is sitting.
All three are here.
All 3 of them, okay. Wonderful, wonderful. At any rate, the best compliment that I can give to Lori is that she's a good friend of mine and is willing to put up with me. And you came to hear her, not me, so without further ado, Lori Erickson.
Thank you, Lori. It's so much fun to be here. I look out and I see a lot of people that I know, people that I haven't seen in a long time, so thank you for turning out. I do understand that you haven't had a lot of public programs for a while, so part of it I think is me and part of it is it's just nice to be out doing a public program. So thank you for coming, if either one of those explanations is true. So tonight I wanted to talk to you about genealogy, and I would guess that that's a subject that probably many of you are interested in. I have a couple questions for you. How many of you have done, sent off your saliva, spit to be tested for ancestry? Okay, about half of you, all right. And how many of you have done some genealogical research in your family? Good, well I'm sort of preaching to the choir tonight then, aren't I? So I thought I would begin by telling you about this book that I've written that came out last fall that's about tracing my family roots. But when I wrote the book, we're all interested in our family, but I wasn't sure other people would be interested in my family. And so I wanted to make sure in my book that I broadened it and talked in more general terms about the pleasures and the challenges of genealogy, but also the spiritual aspects of genealogy, because in my work I have 2 main focuses of interest, spirituality and travel. All of my last 3 books have been in that general intersection. And the more I thought about genealogy, the more I realized that pilgrimage is really part of it. Pilgrimage in the sense of a journey that often requires a lot of preparation. It often may be to a place that is fairly difficult to get to in one way or another. And then after you return home from a pilgrimage, there's a time of integration and thinking about what the trip meant to you, and it can often be a life-changing journey. And if you think about family research travel, if you've been to perhaps a place in Europe where your ancestors came from, or places in the United States that have some connection to your family, they might well have been pilgrimages. And I'm hoping when people read my book that some of that, the implications of that will become more clear. So with that, I'm going to show you some pictures from my book. I was so smart to marry a man who takes photographs. My husband, Bob Sessions, is in the back. You might possibly follow him on Facebook or Instagram. He taught at Kirkwood philosophy for many years, and then since he's retired, we've had a wonderful time traveling around the world together. And he takes pictures and I write. So this is a picture of the cover of my book. If you are familiar with Scandinavian traditions, you recognize rose mauling, no doubt. And I love the fact that there's crossed Viking swords at the bottom. Not a motif you usually find in rose mauling, but I thought they did a nice job on the cover. The subtitle is Ancestors, Stories, and the Spirits We Inherit, the Soul of the Family Tree. My previous book is Near the Exit, Travels with a Not-So-Grim Reaper. And this is the one that Lauren Horton was just an essential guide for me. He's, who you probably know, is a specialist in Victorian death customs. And there aren't that many people that you can just sit and talk with for hours about death customs, and you're both fascinated, but Lauren and I had any number of meetings where we did that, and he was a great advisor on the book. So this book is about reflections on places that have taught me about mortality. Some of them are far away, like Mayan sites in Mexico and Guatemala. Some are close to home, like the nursing home where my mother lived for a number of years. And so it's a mixture of travelogue and memoir and spiritual reflection. And then my book before that, the one that sort of started me off on this particular bend in their writing path, is Holy Rover, Journeys in Search of Mystery, Miracles, and God. And this is a memoir built around trips to a dozen holy sites around the world. So, and all of them are for sale at the back after my talk. So, some of you might recognize the style of the artist here, Claudia McGehee, who's a well-known Iowa City-based artist, did this wonderful illustration of a woman peering through strands of DNA, and it's a nice symbolic representation of what my book is about. It starts out, my book does, with me spitting into a test tube and finding out that I am almost all Norwegian, which is not surprising because I'm from Decorah in Northeast Iowa. And I'm probably one of the least ethnically diverse people in the United States. In my book, I say, I think it's like 86% Norwegian, but then they give you those updates later. And so after the book was finished, I found out that I'm actually 100% Norwegian. And given the fact that my first ancestors came to Decorah in 1850, that means that they spent a lot of time socializing only with fellow Norwegians in Decorah. So there you go. So my last name is Erickson, and my entire life I have said that I'm a descendant of the great Norse explorer Leif Erickson, and he's pictured here, a statue in Newfoundland in Canada. And for much of my life, it was just sort of an amusing kind of thing. Leif Erickson, Lori Erickson, our names sound alike. We're both of Norwegian stock. We love to travel. He was one of the good Vikings, not one of the raiding and pillaging Vikings. He came to the New World, to North America, in about the year 1000 and founded almost certainly the first European colony in North America. And there was a colony there for about 10 years, and then it failed. It was just too remote, too hard to maintain connections to Greenland, where the rest of the colony lived, and so it eventually failed. But that colony has been excavated, and a lot of archaeological work has been done there. So it actually is well supported by the archaeological evidence that Leif Erickson was there. And he was my ancestor, so there you go. One of the things I decided to do in my book was to spend quite a bit of time talking about the Viking Age, in part because of this somewhat mythical connection I have to Leif Erickson, but also because it is so interesting, especially if you have any sort of interest in history. The Vikings were very, they had an influence far beyond their small numerical size, and how remote their homeland was. Between the 9th and the 11th centuries, they traveled to about 40 countries around the world. They were explorers, they were raiders, they were slavers, they were colonizers. They influenced the culture of many different countries, from Russia. The word Russia most likely comes from the name of a Swedish tribe of Vikings named the Rus, R-U-S. Rus means rower, and so one of the strains of Russian culture is Viking culture. And Russians take a lot of pride in their Norse heritage as well. Of course, in England, Ireland, a lot of raiding was done in those countries. The north of Ireland was controlled by the Norse, by Vikings, for an extensive period of time. The city of York was founded by Vikings. So this map at the beginning of my book is an indication of the travels of the Vikings, the Norse, and their adventuresome spirit, that they ended up in a lot of different places. We know about the story of Leif Erickson and the settlement in North America because of the Icelandic sagas, which are a set of stories, oral stories, that were written down about in the 13th century. And the stories are of people who lived 100, 200 years before. And the people who wrote them down were Christian. The people they were talking about were generally pagan. And so there's a lot of interesting sort of tensions built into the Icelandic sagas. For a long time, it was thought that the sagas, especially in relation to the story of the Vinland settlement in North America, that it was largely fictional, that no one had ever found evidence that the Vikings were actually there, and a lot of people had looked for a settlement and they hadn't found it. So one of the stories I tell in my book is of the finding of this settlement in 1960. A Norwegian explorer and raconteur and historian named Ingstead, I think that was his name, went all up and down the eastern seaboard looking for Viking ruins. And it was just like needle in a haystack sort of thing. But he found some in Newfoundland, on the very tip of northeastern tip of Newfoundland. And he used clues from the sagas in order to find it. There are two sagas that relate to the Vinland settlement. And they're wild stories, and I recount some of the details from them. They've got corpses that sit up and talk. They've got witches who appear and ask for the spirits to be summoned. They've got axe-murdering Viking women, and they have Leif Erickson, who was a man of moderation in all things, as the saga says, which is not a description normally applied to a Viking. So this is saga. This is from the museum in Newfoundland that Bob and I visited. This is a picture from of the Newfoundland settlement, recreated. You can see one of the sod houses. It's a living history sort of thing, and I describe that in my book, of going in and visiting with people who are 1,000 years old, and they do a really lovely job with the interpretation there. It's a fascinating historical site. A couple of people we met there. This is also at the Newfoundland settlement. This is a reconstruction of the type of boat that the Vikings probably used to come to the New World. It's not the classic dragon-headed boat that we have in popular imagination. That was more of a warship, fast and sleek. This was more of sort of a sturdy workhorse of a boat. It's called a Knar is the name of it. Smaller, slower, but better for hauling animals and all the equipment that they would have needed to establish a settlement there. So another part of my book is this idea of choosing ancestors. And so I have fun with genealogy in the book. I am certainly a great admirer of people who do their research right and check all their facts and make sure that everything is well documented. But I also think that there's a lot of imagination. There's a lot of room for imagination in genealogical research. And in my case, I decided to adopt this woman as my foremother. Her name was Gudrid the Far Traveler. She was the sister-in-law of Leif Erickson. I ran across her when we were traveling around Iceland years ago, and we came upon this statue. And it's a beautiful statue, a woman with a stylized longbow. And a map and a sign next to it said that Gudrid was probably the most well-traveled woman of the Middle Ages. She came in the second wave of settlement to Vinland in Newfoundland, gave birth to the first child of European descent in the New World. That's the child who's standing on her shoulder. She lived there with her husband for about 3 years and then went back to Greenland and then to Iceland. She was renowned for her goodness and her kindness and her wisdom. She straddled that boundary between the pagan world and the Christian world, which is always, I think, those boundary times, those boundary people are especially interesting because you have threads of a lot of different things that come together. And so Gudrid was a pagan when she was growing up. There's a wonderful story in the sagas of her singing songs to summon the spirits who are going to assist the witch. But then she became a Christian. In fact, she became a nun later in her life, though it's not quite clear in the context of the very primitive church that would have existed in Iceland at that time what that would have involved. But later in her life, she walked on pilgrimage to Rome, which is really pretty remarkable when you think about it. She was, by then she'd lost her husband, and so she probably travels with other people, but still it was a very brave thing for her to do. She most likely sailed to Denmark and then walked all the way from Denmark to Rome and back again. So she went to the New World, she went to the heart of the Old World, and so that's why they call her the most well-traveled woman of the Middle Ages, is because of that. And as soon as I read her story, it was like, how could I not be related to Gudrid the Far Traveler? And actually, in the saga, she gets more attention than Leif Erickson does. And in Iceland today, she is claimed as a foremother of much of the population, because Iceland is a small place and everybody's related to each other. But they still remember Gudrid and honor her. Another thing I did for the course of my research, the wonderful thing about writing the books I do is that it gives me the excuse to do things that I may not have the guts to do otherwise. So I dressed up like a Viking woman for a weekend, and I went to a Viking festival. And it was so much fun to hang around people who are as obsessed with the Viking age as I was at the time. Here are a couple of people from the festival. It was in Moorhead, Minnesota. It's a yearly Viking festival, and it turns out there's a whole subculture of people who love to dress up like Vikings on weekends. Took a bit of a hiatus with COVID, but I mean, these people are hardcore. They make their own. There are people there who make linen, for goodness sake. Linen is amazingly complicated to make, but they make their own linen. They make their own moccasins, well, not moccasins, but leather shoes. They dye their clothes with plants. They practice battle techniques. And they do the authentic cooking, of course, and weaving. So it was really a lot of fun to hang out with them. And one of the suggestions I give in my book is that if you're interested in your family history, that if you can find a reenactment of some sort, it really is a wonderful thing to immerse yourself into the sounds and the smells and the sights of your ancestors. It just totally brings history to life. And there are a lot of places where you can do that, museums as well as volunteers who get together. And then there's a turn in my book to my particular family. And these are actually not my relatives directly, but they could be my relatives, because my family is full of people who look like that in the 1880s. This is a photograph done by Knut Knudsen, who was one of the first professional photographers in Norway. It's of a standard sort of Norwegian family in the immigrant era. And I should say, most of these photos are in my book. They introduce each of the chapters, and so some of them are from Bob, some are historical photos, as you can see. So this introduces a chapter on where I actually start doing some genealogy, rather than just like read history books and go to Viking festivals and things like that. I went to a genealogical resource center in Madison, Wisconsin for Norwegian genealogy, and with their help was able to trace one set of great-grandparents in particular. I knew in writing my story, no one was going to be interested in hearing about very many of my Norwegian relatives. And so I chose Hans and Silla really at random. I looked at the chart that I'd been given by Ancestry.com, and I just picked them out because I like the sound of their names. And it turned out to be a really wonderful piece of serendipity, because Hans and Silla had an interesting story. And they came to the United States in 1850, which was very early in terms of the Norwegian exodus. And best of all, they were both baptized in the most beautiful church in Norway, the Borgen Church. Some of you perhaps have been to Norway. If you haven't, maybe you've seen the movie Frozen. The animators went to the Borgen Church to get ideas for the type of architecture to feature in that Disney movie. It's one of the most spectacular buildings in Norway. Beautiful church. And my great-great-grandfather and grandmother were baptized there. It was so nice to discover that. Also in the book, I talk about myths in relation to genealogy, both large and small. I make the point that it's an unusual family that doesn't have some myths connected to family stories. Maybe someone who supposedly went on the gold rush, or a grandparent who knew Thomas Edison, or something like that. And a lot of times the stories are true, but a lot of times these stories in family take on a life of their own. And that's largely harmless. But there's also other sorts of myth-making that gets done. So for example, this is the Kensington Runestone. Does anyone here know of the Kensington Runestone? Okay. 50 years ago, probably everyone would have known about the Kensington Runestone. It was one of the most famous artifacts of it was found in 1898, and up until about 1955, it was very well known. It was exhibited at the International World's Fair. It was featured in Smithsonian Magazine and all the big publications. And it was a stone that has Norse Viking runes on it, the type of sort of scratchy writing that the Vikings would have used. It was found in the field of a Swedish-American farmer in rural Minnesota. And the runes deciphered by scholars indicated that it had been created by Vikings who were traveling through that part of the country in about the year, I think, 1200 or so. And they had a fight with some of the native people. Some of them died, and this was a marker for them. And so for the people of Minnesota, especially the Scandinavians, this was like proof that the Vikings had been there, and that they weren't strangers in a strange land, that their people had been there long before Columbus. And so it was a real mark of pride. One of the reasons why the Minnesota Vikings football team has the Vikings name is probably linked to the Kensington Runestone and all of the publicity around it. The problem is it's almost certainly a hoax, which is, they determined that on a linguistic analysis of the runes, it's all very complicated, but there's never been a really reputable scholar who could authenticate it. Only a couple of rogue scholars said it was authentic. But it's a peculiar story. The farmer never made any money off of it. In fact, it sort of ruined his life in a lot of ways because of the publicity. But it did take on a life of its own, this idea that the Vikings had been in North America a long time ago. Well, in Minnesota, rather. They'd certainly been in Newfoundland. And so I use that then to lead into the Nazi myth relating to the people of the North, the myth of the Aryan race, which of course had profoundly negative consequences in all sorts of ways. And so again, this idea that stories are really powerful and sometimes they're used for ill, and that the sort of myth making that we all do, most likely, in relation to family stories, you know, you have to be careful too. The myths are really important, but they can be misused. Oh, here's the Borgin Church, where my great-grandparents were baptized. It looks like the sort of church that recently converted Vikings would build, you know, because it looks really like a pagan temple. It's got dragon heads coming off of the roof there to protect it. Inside, it's a really interesting building in that there are no floors. This is all open in here. So you go inside and it's a really pretty small floor plan. I mean, it could have held maybe, I don't know, 50 worshipers comfortably. And then you look up and there's this big echoing space in there. It's like being in the inside of a tree. And it so clearly spanned, again, that border between the pagan world and the Christian world in a way that I thought was really fascinating. Because one of the things I realized in writing my book, and getting back to Gudrid spanned that border between the pagan and the Christian world. And I sort of feel like I span borders too, because I'm living during a time when a lot of the traditional religious patterns are fading and the world is in turmoil once again. And so I felt like I had a lot in common with Gudrid, actually, and with those Vikings who were trying to figure out a new world after they had to stop raiding. And then the book ends in Philadelphia, of all places. And Philadelphia, because there was a Viking ship named the Dragon, built in Norway, and it was touring along the East Coast a number of years ago, and so I got the chance to see it, to be on board a Viking warship. I didn't get the chance to be out at sea with it, but it was in the harbor, and I spent a day talking to the people who sail it, and it's a chance for me to reflect upon the fascination that the larger world has still for the Vikings. Even if you don't have Scandinavian ancestry, there still is this cultural sort of fascination with the Vikings and TV shows and superhero movies and books, and you know, that doesn't happen with a lot of ancient cultures, but it has happened with the Vikings, and so I ruminate some on why that might be the case. I think I'll leave the dragon up. And how are we doing on time here? Okay. So I wanted to talk to you, so that's my book, basically, but I wanted to talk to you about some of the ideas that I thought were really applicable to other people's genealogical work, and maybe not just genealogical work, but just trying to relate to your family, to the ones who are living and the ones who are dead, and of course we all have far more dead relatives than we do living relatives. And so one of the ideas that I ran across in doing research for the book actually comes from a woman in Minneapolis named Kari Toring, and she has developed sort of a rebirth of Norse pagan traditions. She calls it Volvastav. Volva was a term for a sorceress, a witch of the pagan, pre-Christian days. And so she really is trying to reinvigorate the tradition, bring it into the modern age. She still considers herself a Lutheran as well, which is interesting. So again, blending different traditions. And so I spent time with Kari. We went to the Viking Festival together. I interviewed her. And one of the ideas that she talks about that I thought was really fascinating is something called the web of weird. And weird, spelled W-Y-R-D. It's where we get our term weird. And when we say something is weird, we know what it means. That's weird. But when the Vikings said something was weird, it would be something much more significant. Weird meant something like fate or destiny. It was an explanation for what happened. One scholar compares it to how many of us view science. You know, that we have this sort of bedrock belief that science can explain things. We may not be able to explain how you might get a rocket up into the air, but you know that there's a scientific explanation for it. Well, the Vikings would have thought that about weird, that everyone's life was governed by weird, that when you were born, there were supernatural beings called the Norns who determined what your weird would be. But it wasn't just fatalism either. There was this idea that your strands through the web of weird connected with other people's strands. And your particular corner of this huge web was called your urolog. And so when you were born, if you were lucky, you had threads that were strong and well woven. But a lot of people didn't back then, and that's true today too. You know, you might have gotten threads that were frayed or broken or misshaped, miswoven in some ways. And so a lot of what Kari Turing's work is about is trying to reweave the web of weird, of trying to come to peace with the past, of sending healing back into the past, to try to come to terms with the sort of ancestral legacy that all of us have, whether we realize it or not. And so I love that metaphor and that term of the web of weird. Part of it is, it's just so much fun to say, web of weird. And this idea of, you know, some of us have weirder webs of weird than others. But I think the metaphor, I think it resonates and fits in with so many other metaphors that we have for, you know, a family tree, the lines of connection that you have, this sense that sometimes those connections are frayed, and that part of doing genealogy is coming to terms with that and in a sense reweaving that. And so I really like that idea of web of weird. I also really like this idea of choosing ancestors. And I mentioned a little bit about that in relation to Gudrid the Far Traveler. One of the things I didn't want my book to be about was just sort of genetics. You know, like, unless you have a genetic connection to this person, you really, you know, you can't claim them, you can't really be influenced by them, or unless you have children, you don't have an influence on the coming generations. And I think it's way too limited an idea. Certainly in the Viking Age, there's a long tradition of much more emphasis on clan, much more emphasis on fostering of children, of connections being made between differing families. And so I like the idea too of looking to the past for inspiration. I've always loved history. It's one of the reasons why Lauren and I get along so well. And one of the things I think is really sad in the world today is that we don't pay enough attention to history. People, I think especially younger people, they don't see the magic of it, how fascinating it is. And that these were real people and they had amazing stories and that we can connect with them. And so what I encourage people to do through my book, I hope, is to look in their own families and to think, well, who are the role models that you might look to? So for example, my husband's cousin, Andrea, has always had an interest in art. And she found that she has a distant cousin who was a well-known artist in England. And even though it's a pretty tenuous connection in a lot of ways, she really has made an effort to connect with his work. She's gone to the place where he lived, she has collected some of his art, and that's helped make her life deeper and richer. And so, again, opening up this idea of genealogy, that it's more than collecting names and dates, it's allowing our imaginations to flower as well. Just a couple more things, then I'll open it up to questions. There's a whole chapter on badly behaving relatives. because we all have them, don't we? I had the Vikings. That was quite a long time ago. They were often badly behaving. But of course, all of us, no doubt, have relatives who, if they showed up at our door, we might think twice about inviting them in, or we have difficulties with them for all sorts of complicated reasons. And so this idea of genealogy is the wrong hobby to have if you want to stand on your moral high horse, because all of us have a mixture of villains and scoundrels and heroes and admirable people in our family tree. And I think that the sort of recognition of our shared humanity, our shared brokenness, it's not a bad thing to be reminded of that. And I actually think that's one of the positive things that has happened in genealogy within the last few decades. You know, for a long time, genealogy was often seen as, and often done as, the realm of the very wealthy. You know, you think of royal families tracing their lines of nobility, making sure that people didn't marry into the lower classes. And that's sort of been left behind now. That I think there's a real tendency for people to want to connect to colorful characters, to try to find parts of their family story that's been forgotten. And I think that's wonderful, you know, to bring up these overlooked and maybe a little less respectable parts of people's history. I'm going to open it up to questions because I'm hoping we can get a discussion going about some of your reactions and maybe some of what you've learned from family history work. So, any comments? Yes? Uh-huh. Oh, you were waiting. Oh, okay. All right, you won't have to talk then. Yes? Uh-huh.
Some while back, I remember reading that you had a lot of Norwegian farmers of modest means who took the off-season to go Viking. I don't know how factual that is, but I thought that was very interesting.
Well, it's a good question, and it's a multifaceted answer that I think there's general agreement that much of the raiding done by Vikings was done by people who did it on a part-time basis and who did it when they were young. And so they would plant their crops and then they would go raiding, and it was often young men who were looking to make money for a bride price so they could come back home, or if there weren't enough women in the village, that they would go and raid and bring back wives. But then once they were, had what they wanted, they probably wouldn't raid again. But then there were the men who financed all of this, because in order to have a longbow, you had to be a person of substantial means. There's a lot of work that went into that. And so they would have been on a different social class and would have probably been in it, as more of a continuing business, shall we say. But it was during a time in Scandinavia when there was a lot of social upheaval. It was a gradual shift from small chieftains to a unified kingdom. Lack of land, especially in Norway, was always a huge issue. As the population grew, where do all those new people go? So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, we have a friend who years ago went to the Danish Museum, the National Danish Museum, and he said there was a big exhibit on the Vikings, and he said his impression was that the Vikings were just misunderstood farmers. And I think maybe that's not quite accurate, but yes?
That actually brings up an important point, and that is how you got from the fierce raiding Vikings to the quiet, docile Lutherans.
Thank you for planning that question. That's my husband in the back. So it is one of the central questions of my book, and it was one of the motivations for me to want to write my book is actually that question. So I grew up in this strongly Norwegian American community. I come from a long line of really well-behaved people. hardworking farmers, and one of the worst things you could do was to stand out in any way. You didn't want to have people talk. What would they think? And I was just sort of steeped in this. And then the more I started learning about the Vikings, it was like, what happened? Like the people, at least this portion of the North and Scandinavia during this period, they were fearless explorers, and they obviously didn't care what people thought about them. And so, and that also is reflected in their religion. I have a chapter talking about the religious views or the spiritual practices of the Norse. And in some ways it's hard to tell exactly what they believed, because they had very few things written down. They had runes, but they weren't really used in the same way we would think of written language being used. And so there are these stories that are passed down, but it was a wild spiritual world. You had Thor and Odin and Freya and murders and treachery and just sort of passion on this Wagnerian scale. And then Scandinavia became Christian around the year 1000. And they not only became Christian, after a few hundred years, they really embraced Lutheranism. Became more Lutheran than Germany in all sorts of ways, which still kept its Catholic traditions. And so it was a particularly buttoned down version of Lutheranism. If you've seen the movies of, who's that famous filmmaker?
Bergman.
Ingmar Bergman films, yes. Not Viking people in those movies at all. Very tight emotional control. And so I play around with the idea of what happened. And it's not like I could answer that question, but I think part of maybe what happened was this sort of swing of the pendulum, that during the Viking Age there was so much passion and drama and feuds and all of that, and then there was a reaction against that. And Christianity in all sorts of ways improved the lives of people in Scandinavia, I think, especially for women. But then I think maybe the pendulum swung too far the other way. An aspect of my book that I didn't mention is the fact that I went to Norway, of course, because I had to go to Norway to write a book about my family, and connected with a childhood friend there, and so got the chance to learn a little bit at least about contemporary Norway. And her husband is a pastor, actually, a Lutheran pastor, and so we had a lot of conversations about religion in Scandinavia today, which, as you're probably aware, Scandinavia, though it certainly has deep Christian roots, is one of the most secular parts of the world in terms of religious attendance. So again, this pendulum swing from the pagan world, the drama of the pagan world, to the Lutheran world, and now to a largely secular perspective. And what I sort of conclude is that maybe the continuing thread is the incredible beauty of the Norwegian landscape, which almost everyone in Norway seems to have as their real spiritual path, is to be outside, to ski and to hike and to enjoy the beauty, the incredible beauty of Norway. I traveled a lot around the world, and I think Norway is the most beautiful country I've ever been to. It's just stunning, especially in the fjord region. So anyway, there are a lot of different threads in the book, Bob, and I'm glad that you brought that up. David.
I'm intrigued by your choosing one piece and your conversations with others who've done this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you settle on what criteria you sort of reject, what their personality becomes foods or accusations or livelihoods or others?
Mm-hmm. So I'll repeat the question to make sure everyone heard it. So David asked, how do you choose an ancestor? Because you've got, you go back enough generation, I think it's like 10 generations, you have 75,000 ancestors. That's a lot. I would say that often I think they choose you, which sounds a little woo-woo, I know, but the fact that Bob and I, in the middle of Iceland, happened to stop at this roadside park, and there's Gudrid the Far Traveler. And that stop really was the genesis for this book, was to see that statue. I didn't know it at the time, but I think all of us interested in history, interested in genealogy, I would guess most people have certain people that they're drawn to, or certain eras and who knows how to explain that, but there's just something that draws you. And I think that I would encourage people to listen to that. Yeah. Find out as much as you can and then see where your nose takes you. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. John.
Nobody's as good as you are at identifying holy places.
I don't know about that.
And I'm curious, in the course of this journey, whether something either literal or figurative became a holy place for you, either in direct tracing of ancestry or more imaginative tracing.
Mm-hmm. Did everyone hear that?
Maybe there are clues in your photos here.
Yeah. Well, the place that immediately comes to mind, and I think this is an experience that probably other people can relate to if you've had the chance to visit the land where your ancestors lived. So I got the chance to go to the farm where Hans had lived for a time. And he was basically a sharecropper, so he lived on different farms. But I knew that he had been on this particular farm. And I sort of prepared for the moment because I'd gone to the farm where I had grown up outside of Decorah, no longer in the family. But before we went to Norway, I went to that farm and I picked up some soil from the farm, and I knew I wanted to take it to Norway. And so when we were at Hans's farm, and there's the whole story, of course, of how we got there. You can read the book to hear that. So I put the soil from Iowa on his farm, and then I got some of his soil, and I brought it back, and I put it on Hans and Scylla's grave near Decorah. And so it's a holy spot in that it moved. You know, it was sort of the soil. You know, and if you think of how important soil was for landless peasants, you know, to be a poor person in Norway or in Ireland, or you know, pick your country, meant you owned nothing. You owned no land at all. And so the fact that my ancestors ended up with a pretty good sized farm in Northeast Iowa, and now in death they have a nice monument, you know, for you know, a small town or a rural cemetery. It's quite nice, and they've got this bit of land that's theirs in perpetuity, and so that was really meaningful to do that. And again, sort of connecting the threads. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Do you have any information about what percentage of the Norwegian people at the time of the Vikings were Vikings, and how many were ordinary people living there?
The historians speculate it was maybe 10% who went raiding. Almost all men, but there are some indications, as probably you've seen from news reports, that there probably were some female warriors, but most of it would have been done by men. So 10%, you know, that's not that much. The rest of, they stayed home and behaved themselves.
It was a feudal system back then?
I wouldn't say feudal in sort of the classic sense, but most people got by on very little, and yeah, it was chieftains rather than feudal, I would say. Mm-hmm. And the situation was different in different parts of Scandinavia. So Norway, as you probably know, is very, very mountainous. Only 4% of it is arable. Sweden is much different than that. Denmark as well. And so a lot of the raiders, if I understand the historical record correctly, a lot of the raiders came from Norway, because they didn't have as many options. A lot of the Swedes and the Danes would go, well, the Danes went to England, and the Swedes went into Russia. You know, all those network of rivers going into the east. And they tended to be more merchants and traders and colonizers. They would just move there. They weren't raiders as much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated by the woman who was the far traveler.
Mm-hmm.
And was it only women of a high social class that would do this, would be permitted to do this? Or was there peasants who also did this?
As far as I know, I think in the sagas there are very few women who did anything like Gudrid did. I mean, there were certainly strong women who were were murdering and double dealing, and as well as doing admirable sorts of things. I think it was pretty rare for a woman to travel outside of their region at all, let alone as far as Gudrid did. In terms of social class, I would say that she was in the merchant class, and so her grandmother was a slave, and when she married her second husband, the suggestion is that her mother-in-law didn't like her because she thought she was beneath their social class, but she won her over, of course, because she was so likable. And her husband was a very gifted merchant, clearly. And so there wasn't nobility in the sense of social class, but certainly wealth meant a lot. I mean, the Vikings, more than anything, were business people. You know, they may have traded in slaves and, you know, took land and everything, but they were shrewd business people. They just sort of looked for opportunities, and if it was legal, they would do it. If it was illegal and they could get by with, you know, minimum sort of effort, they would take it. And so, yeah, the striations of society weren't really complicated, I think. And there was quite a bit of fluidity. Even if you were born a slave, you could buy your way out of slavery. Not that slavery was good, I'm not saying that, but there was a lot of movement back and forth. Bob?
I think, to me, one of the striking things about visiting the farm in Norway was when you threw that dirt from Iowa on the hillside, it doubled the amount of dirt on the hillside. Okay, it's all rocks. But it helps to make sense out of why it is in the 1850s and 60s and so on. They all came here. I mean, there was nothing to keep them there.
Right.
You couldn't make a living.
Well, and another interesting historical tidbit was that historians have looked at the immigrant groups who came in the 19th century, and the Norwegians held on to farming longer than any of the other European groups, just in aggregate. And I think part of it was they came from a land where farming was so hard. And so they got here, and you know, they got land, you know, through the Homestead Act or whatever, and they kept on to it. And they liked being farmers. And they didn't have to talk a lot either when they were farming, so. Do we have, let me see my watch here. Yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
Did you read the book, Jane Smiley's book, The Greenlanders?
I read it years ago, yes, and I remember not liking it very much. I should read it again now because I know so much more about the context, and I know that it's...
It was a sad, depressing story.
Yeah.
I mean, there was so much interesting. I loved it. I
Mhm.
read it 3 times.
Well, you're motivating me to read it again. I should, especially, as I said, now that I know the background. Yeah.
The heroine of the story had the same name as my mother. She was Norwegian, and she was a weaver. She was very adept at weaving beautiful blue wool fabric. But I just was just fascinated with the history there. My understanding was that Jane Smiley went to Reykjavik in Iceland and did her research there, on which she based the story. But of course, I mean,
I think a lot of that comes from the sagas too, the Icelandic sagas. Yeah.
hard existence.
Oh, it was brutally hard in Greenland and in Newfoundland. You know, all the difficulties of Scandinavia multiplied. by the isolation and the fact that the winters were even harsher, lack of trees. Yeah, they were tough people. One of the most interesting conversations I had in the research for the book was to talk to a man who sails the contemporary longboat. He's been sailing Viking longboats for 20 years. He says he's probably the most experienced longboat sailor in the world today. And he talked about how hard it is to sail a longboat. They were masters of technological feats at the time. You know, the ability to go really fast across the water. It's almost like they're a leaf on the water. You know, they sort of bounce like that. But there's so much give in the sides that rivets pop out. You know, a lot of them sank. There was no underdeck on a Viking longboat, and so you were on deck the whole time in the North Atlantic, fog, ice, wind, snow. And he said that even with, you know, super high-tech warm clothes, your body almost goes into shock when you encounter those conditions for the first time. And he said he just has so much admiration for the Vikings that they did that, and women did that, children did that when they were going to Newfoundland or to Greenland. And they were just a lot tougher than we are. Yeah. I have to tell you a funny story that I didn't put in the book, but it says a lot about my people. So years ago, I had the chance to go to Iceland, and there's a Viking boat museum, and it's built around this boat that was sailed in the year 2000 on the 1,000-year anniversary of Lake Erickson's voyage. And so they have the boat there, and it was a travel writer thing, and so they had the engineer who had led the expedition, and I was so excited to meet him. I mean, here was someone who built a Viking longboat and then sailed it all the way across the sea, and so I sort of elbowed my way past the other writers and so I could interview him, and I said, so how was it, you know, what was it like to sail across the Atlantic? And he thought for a little bit, and he said, it wasn't so bad. And that was basically the interview. I couldn't get him to say anything else about it. But it was so, I knew, those are my people. You know, you just don't make a big deal about things. Well, just a couple more things. I do have books for sale, $15 a piece, but also libraries have them. They're audio versions that you can get online. I also have a monthly newsletter. It comes out on the first of every month. It's free, of course, and it usually has some kind of theme, talks about some aspect of travel and or spirituality. And so I have a sign-up sheet for that I'll bring to the back as well. And I wish you good luck on your own family explorations. And I think one other thing I'll say, I do think not everyone's interested in genealogy, and not everyone has to be interested in genealogy, but I think it's great if every family and every generation has someone who's sort of the keeper of the flame, you know, the one who tries to save the stories, and so that, you know, in generations to come, they can pick up the story and continue it, because it's those threads that make us who we are and who help all of us, you know our sense of community and our connections. And so genealogy, it's a good thing. So thank you.